All right, well, welcome everybody. We've got 83 people here tonight, which is an excellent turnout. Thank you all. This is being recorded. For those who don't know me, my name's Anthony Smith. I'm the chair of the Airworthiness Department. If you do not have your microphone muted, would you mind muting your microphone? Just keeps the audio quality for the recording better than having all the bangs and bumps and things going on as people wriggle around in the background. If you do have questions tonight, use the chat box. I've had feedback from some people to say that it's a bit tedious to start typing in questions during the question sessions, but would you mind, feel free to start asking questions while I'm talking and presenting, and I will try and get around to your questions. One question already: any clues about why I can't hear you? I suspect that's going to be with your computer audio settings. I don't have direct control over that at the moment. I'm assuming that everyone else can hear me talking and see my lips moving. All right, I will try and experiment later on at the end of this evening where I'll let people unmute and ask questions directly. We'll see how that goes. So tonight we'll cover where the airworthiness system's currently at and the current health of the system. What are some of the activities that we've been up to in the last 6 months since the previous webinar? We have a guest presenter tonight, Phil Dodd, who will be discussing human factors within airworthiness. And I will then cover recent defects and incidents. And there's been a few. So where are we at with the airworthiness system and its health? Airworthiness ratings, very difficult to run formal courses in many of the regions in this COVID environment. I do note that some clubs ran local courses. However, there's been a noticeable increase in mentoring going on. The number of people with airworthiness ratings has been generally static, without any real gains or losses. The numbers are a little skewed because we had many people in the states that were locked down with COVID who delayed renewing their membership, such that we had a little bit of the membership numbers dropped for a little while. They're picking it back up now as people now renew their membership. But when I ran the filter and derived all these numbers, there was some funny numbers coming out with the membership. One thing to note when you look at the number of component of replacement versus the annual inspectors, I look at these as totals. You will see that if we have a drop in the number of replacement of components people, we will see a corresponding increase in the number of annual inspectors as these people are promoted up through the system. So in the last 6 months, there's been a drop of 10 people with their highest level of rating as a replacement of components. We've now picked up those 10 people as annual inspectors, so that promotion of people is flowing through the system, which is good to see. How we deal with formal courses into the future is going to really depend on how we go with the COVID restrictions, border restrictions and so forth. It's still going to be challenging for another 12 months by all appearances. Hot topic at the moment is refresher training. The 6-year revalidation on airworthiness ratings was introduced back in 2015 by Rob Hambry, one of my predecessors as the chair. A lot of things had changed in recent years at that point, and many people with airworthiness ratings had not been keeping up to date, and that is still partially a problem we see even now. So there are a large number of refresher courses that were run in the 2015-2016 timeframe. 6 years are passed, and now we have many people due for revalidation refreshers. And they've been receiving a bundle of automatic email notifications via Go membership. At present, the RTOAs can extend your airworthiness rating by up to 12 months, and that's what's detailed in WASP 3. There's been a brand new revalidation package that's now been put together, and a very big thank you to Len Dykeman and Dennis Stacey for spending an awful lot of time on hammering that together. And that's now been disseminated out to the RTOAs, and that was last Monday, so this is hot off the press. So the RTOAs are now looking at running refresher training courses, and if you contact your regional RTOA for dates and locations, I'm sure they'll be more than happy to help. The underlying question is, why are we doing this refresher and revalidation process? Part of the answer is Sid Decker wrote a magazine article back in November 2019. That's the GFA magazine. And that was at the end of the year where we had 5 fatalities in the previous 12 months, which was a bit of a shock. And that put gliding safety at about 1 fatality per 10,000 hours. Normally, I think we're back 1 every 50,000 hours or that kind of time frame. In that article, he points to a number of ways to improve this level of safety. But it's not that we need more rules, but we need a more professional approach and to improve the expertise of those involved. The more professional approach is not necessarily to wear a suit and tie. It is very much a professional mindset. It's being prepared to learn new things, to build and improve your knowledge and skills, letting others know when things don't necessarily work out the way you thought they were going to work out, and to be able to receive honest, constructive feedback. So one of the big factors, one of the big themes of tonight, of course, is going to be this human factors things, the way people think, and some of the ways that's contributed to some of the more recent accidents and incidents. Six months ago, I mentioned that there was a noticeably lower response on when the Form 2 returners handed back to the GFA office. This is just a cumulative chart of how many months after the Form 2 was signed off as to when the office received the Form 2 return. Now, we use these returns to calculate flying hours, and that all goes into the calculation of risk for the GFA insurance policies, and it goes back into our reporting requirements back into CASA, where we start negotiating with CASA over things, and we can point out how many people we have involved, how many hours we're flying. This year we've had COVID, which has changed the circumstances in which we're operating. This has been external to GFA, so this is nothing that the GFA has done or anything that I've done within airworthiness. But we've seen somewhere around 5 to 7 or 8% of people have changed their behaviour as a direct result. So we've got this emergent gap where people who would normally have been returning their Form 2 returns in the first 3 months, which is what's required, now leaving it until they're planning the next Form 2 and trying to purchase the next Form 2 kit, and then suddenly getting reminded that, hey, you need to go and give us your hours before we'll release the kit to you. It's an interesting thing that these different priorities in our lives and external influence has resulted in this noticeable change in human behaviour that's completely unrelated. So what have we been doing for the last 6 months? We were planning airworthiness courses for both the women's and the juniors. That's on hold at the moment. We were successful in completing the theory side of things with the juniors, delivered via webinar. We were planning on having the practical courses at Camden, which very promptly caused the New South Wales government to lock down the state and the city, which has really been a major pain in the proverbial. We were planning on delivering the Women's Airworthiness course in a similar manner. That's currently on hold. My funding for those courses runs out at the end of April. I'm looking at getting the women's course back up and running in that March-April timeframe. The juniors are trying to align the practical course with university and high school holidays, and that looks like it's going to be pushed back into that June timeframe of next year. Lifepo4 Batteries, as I said 6 months ago, we were looking at adopting a policy similar to what's done in Europe with the CSTAN SC034B. We have purchased the battery standards. We need to work through and do a bit of due diligence with those standards. And we are looking at defining a minimum standard and feature set so that any brand and model of Lifepo4 battery can be used rather than having GFA Airworthiness specify particular brand and models. That's very much a work in progress at the moment. We have a part-time junior working in the GFA office as of this week and next week. We have a lot of stored paper that needs to be scanned, filed and then disposed of. There's quite a comprehensive technical library in the GFA office. There's about half a dozen filing cabinets. That all requires cataloguing and then filing a very large compactus that the office has purchased. That's going to be a long-term work in progress. When I was last in the GFA office, I'm in Adelaide. I haven't been able to get to Melbourne for quite some time. I was really surprised that there was a lot of stored paper which predates the previous move of offices. So it looks like someone's packed up a desk full of paper, put it into a box, and it's never been touched ever since. So we're working through that. We're going to go electronic, so it's going to be scanned and filed electronically, and we'll clear out a lot of the old paperwork that's cluttering up the office with the filing cabinets. And if you've been in the GFA office and been into the what is laughably the meeting room, you'll see it's not really a meeting room, it's more a storeroom filled with the filing cabinets and shelving. Modification data and files. With the untimely passing of Mike Burns, we've been working with his daughter to collate a lot of modification data and the files and the records. That is ongoing. We have the CASA audit next Thursday the 9th of December, for the modification approval system, and so we're busily working away and making sure all our I's are dotted and T's are crossed on the modification data. If you do get contacted by Tanya, please help out. We do need to get that squared away. We don't want to impose too much on the Burns family either. And last but not least, as of Monday, there is the new chapter for BSE for hotelier connections. This will supersede ADs 177 and 178. If they're not cancelled already, I'm sure Dennis will be cancelling them by the end of the week. And a huge thank you to Kevin Wilson for the effort he's invested in compiling that chapter. I know there's a couple of comments there in chat already about the hoteliers connection. In terms of the LS substitute connections, we had a lot of fun and games trying to compile approved information from different manufacturers, and because different manufacturers all had different solutions to the problem, it took a fair bit of effort on behalf of Kevin to try and pull all this together. If you have additional data which you would like to see included in that chapter, please forward it to myself, and I'm looking at doing a review and an update on BSE next year, which will then integrate the most recent chapters into the book, and we can update that chapter on hoteliers then. Working in the background, I must confess I've been very busy with Part 149 stuff in the last 6 months, but we are developing the airworthiness training syllabi. That's ticking away in the background. And also we've been working on the IT systems that in the background of the GFA office, in particular the aircraft register. We're trying to make it a bit more user-friendly so that it makes it easier to report to CASA with our reporting requirements. Reduce the amount of repetitive data entry. There's quite a bit of it, and that can lead to a lot of typos being entered. I really believe we should only be entering one piece of information once into the computer, and the computer can then sort it all out from there. We shouldn't be entering the same information 3 or 4 times in different parts of the database. As part of that, we're improving how we record the information in the database, so it makes it a lot easier for me to pull out some of the stats, like in the charts at the bottom of the screen there. I can very rapidly pull out single seat hours, dual seat hours, aircraft that were registered when, or sort by sailplane, sustainer, self-launch kind of categories. So I can merge those two together and pull out how many dual seat self-launch aircraft we have very easily now. So there's been some big improvements in the background, which I hope will save the staff a lot of hours, particularly with going back in and fixing up some of the typos and things like that as they're discovered. All right, any questions so far? If you want to enter them in chat, that'd be great.
It's Doug Harrington. I've just joined you. I gather there was a timing problem.
Whereabouts in the country are you, Doug?
West Australia.
Yeah, that may have been my typo. I was struggling to work out the umpteen different time zone Australia has in the current summer time of daylight saving. So that was more than likely my fault. This is being recorded, so I'll get this up on YouTube sometime in the next couple of days at the end of it.
Oh, well, I'm just basically recording myself so you know I'm here.
Not a problem, Doug. And yes, we're up to 96 people here now. So there has been a few latecomers. My apologies to any of the Western Australians who've joined late. That would have been completely my fault. All right. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to hand over to Phil Dodd to do his presentation on human factors. Over to you, Phil.
Cool, thank you very much. Hope everybody can hear me, and I'll just click on sharing my screen. So hopefully everybody can see the presentation that's up there.
Yep, looks good.
Cool. Okay, so I'm just going to take a few minutes, won't take too much of everybody's bandwidth time, and just sort of run through a few human factors things, and incorporate into that some of the non-technical skills that would fall under the human factors banner. What I'm going to cover this afternoon is just a bit of an introduction, just a reminder for those that have done a bit of human factors training in the past and those that that haven't, what human factors is and it isn't, and also some of the human factors and non-technical skills concepts as it relates to airworthiness. We're not going to cover everything in that. That's usually a 3-hour course I run with the RFDS engineering staff. We don't have 3 hours this evening, so I'm just going to pick a couple of those to hone in on. To sort of as a lead into that sort of basic human anatomy, we're going to have a little bit look at the eye and its limitations in that, and also a bit of decision making, and then putting all those together. So what is human factors and non-technical skills? Well, first of all, it's not an excuse. I have heard it said that oh, I made the mistake because of my human limitations, or and that sort of thing. Well, by learning about our limitations as people in our abilities and that sort of stuff should then lead us to managing those and actually not making the mistakes in the first place. So it's not an excuse to make mistakes. It explains why we do make mistakes, but it's not an excuse. So the term human factors does refer to a wide range of issues that affect how people perform their tasks in their work and non-work environments. And the study of human factors involves applying scientific knowledge about the human body, its the mind and its cognitive abilities, etc., to better understand human capabilities and limitations, so that there is the best possible fit between people and the systems in which they operate, and hopefully therefore reducing error and increasing safety in what we do. And that's a quote from the CASO Human Factors for Engineers material in there. My definition of human factors is, why do people do dumb things? We don't get out of bed in the morning and specifically think, I'm going to do something dumb today, which is going to cause an issue. You know, we don't just sort of start a Form 2 with the idea that once it gets airborne that the wing's going to fall off. So, you know, why do people do dumb things? And that's sort of been an interest of mine for a number of years. There's a couple of different models that they put out there. Won't spend too much time on these, but that sort of tries and explain what human factors is. The pilots sort of look at the shell model. So we've got the liveware, that's me in the middle, and how I interact between the software, the hardware, the environment, and the other liveware that we need to deal with. So software, things like manuals, MOSPs, procedures, the culture in which we work in, and the safety culture or the lack thereof, and what norms are. So what we normally do around here, and then we sort of interact with those, and they also play a big part in how we operate ourselves. The hardware that we've got to work with, the tools, the aircraft, the parts, etc. From there, the environment. So the physical environment, your workshops, your lighting, the time of day, but also there's things like financial environments, financial constraints, the overall culture of the club that we're working in, and that sort of thing. And then we've also got to interact with other liveware, our helpers, that when we do Form 2s, etc., we've sometimes we've got a helper and that sort of stuff here. So we've got to interact with them, other members, the committee, co-owners of gliders, etc., and the odd visitor that comes through. And we have to use all of our what we call non-technical skills in handling all of those things and putting them all together, as well as our technical skills on how to remove a tossed and that's release and that sort of thing, to make sure that the job that we do is safe. From an engineering or airworthiness, they also refer to the PAIR model, which is very similar. There's a lot of similarities there. The thing I like about this one is the bottom left-hand corner there, we've got actions. So, and how they impact on what we do. So my actions, the actions of others, but also inactions to be taken into account. So I tend to sort of relate to both of these, both as a pilot and as an annual inspector, that these overall come together to explain what human factors are. Some of the concepts, if you do a full human factors course from an engineering perspective, they would look at error management, human performance and its limitations, decision making, fatigue, stress, alcohol and other drugs, communication, teamwork, leadership, professionalism, and how human factors fits within an overall organisational cultural sense. And they're sort of a lot of the concepts that would be covered in a normal human factors workshops. Tonight, I'd sort of want to log into and have a look at the top 3 in particular. And in relation to human performance and its limitations, really drilling down into the eye and its limitations, but also having a look at decision making and stress, and some of the things that lead us to making decisions which, in hindsight, were probably not the best decisions to make. So first of all, we'll have a look at the eye, and as you can see, it has many parts. So this is not going to be a biology lesson, but just a couple of important things to note. The shape of the eye, it actually affects our focus. So light coming in through the lens is focused on the back of the eye. Now, if the shape of the eye changes, the focal point of the image still doesn't change. So if the eye elongates out or shrinks back in, then the focus becomes difficult at certain points. And the shape of the eye does change with age. And having a look at even at the videos of the participants that we've got here tonight, I can see many of us are wearing glasses. So, you know, that's a result of our eyes changing, and our lenses deteriorate over time. So that too can also affect our vision. We can get diseases of the eyes and cataracts and that sort of thing, can all affect our acuity. Just a quick bit of makeup of our eye. There's rods and cones in the back of our eye, and the rods are sort of on the outer side, and they're our low light receptors, and also they are predominantly involved with our peripheral vision. It's generally black and white, so if you sort of look at something in your peripheral vision, you'll probably note that it's less in colour than if you actually directly look at it at something. So I've got a blue water bottle with a grey top over to my right on my desk here, and if I look at the camera and then with my peripheral vision look at that, I can see that's 2 different colours, but I can't really distinguish much between the 2 colours. But if I look directly at it, it's definitely a blue colour in there. So the central part, that's our high light intensity receptors, and that's where we get our colour and our acuity from in there. So we'll have a bit of a look shortly at what problems that will actually cause us when we're doing an inspection of an aircraft. And the other thing is we've got a blind spot. So each eye, as you can see on the bottom diagram there on the right-hand side, where the optic nerve comes in, there are no rods or cones. So any image falling on that little spot there at the optic nerve, the brain doesn't pick up. Now, we generally overcome that as humans because of the fact we've got 2 eyes, and binocular vision, one eye overlaps and compensates for the other. But if we're looking at something in fine detail, and we're looking at something with only one eye because of its position and that sort of stuff, the blind spot comes into being. So a little bit of an exercise, because we've all got our computers and that sort of stuff in front of us. On the screen there's a plus sign on one side and a circle on the other. If you were to cover your left eye and just focus with your right eye on the plus sign, and then slowly move your head towards the screen, in your peripheral vision, the circle would disappear. So if you want to give that a go now while I've got it on the screen, and that's just because the peripheral vision, that image going into the eye, hits the place in the eye where the optic nerve is, and it just disappears. Move your head in further, it readjusts, and then we can pick it up. Move your head back, and we can pick it up. But there's a distance from the screen where you'll lose one or the other on there. We're also, it's our eyes are designed, with our binocular vision, etc., to take into account perspective. Now, I'll give you a little bit of a time to sort of work out what that painting happens to be on the sidewalk. So, I've got a long thing protruding out from a blue thing. So I've had all sorts of things from a flag to a billboard to a sign on there. You'll notice up the top part up in here is a camera. So this painting has been designed to only be viewed from one perspective on there. And so from that perspective, that's what the painting actually is, a lady in the swimming pool, and that's the artist actually trying to get in with her into there. So, perspective plays a big part in how our brain interprets what we're looking at in there. What can we see here? On first sort of look, most people see a bunch of like lemmings going up the staircase, jumping off, and hitting the ground and then running. Whoops. But just focus on one person going up the. Come on, bit of a zip. See if I can get it to run again. There we go. Just focus on one of the little men, and you'll actually see that none of them are actually moving. So we just pinpoint in on one, and all they are is just changing colour. But our brain fills in some gaps and gives the illusion of motion from there. So whilst our eyes are picking up stuff, it's the way our brain then interprets that message. So sometimes we can look at something but not actually see exactly what is actually happening there. We'll move on and just have a look at some decisions, and we'll pick up on the eyesight as we look at a couple of examples and putting this all together at the end. Decisions, how do we make our decisions? Well, if you do a bit of a study in decision-making process and that sort of stuff, they'll generally sort of say 4 to 7 steps are involved in any one decision-making process. So first of all, we've got to identify that a decision needs to be made. Is this component airworthy? We gather the information. So we might take measurements on that component. We'll refer to the maintenance manuals for limitations, etc., for wear and that sort of stuff. And then once we worked out that it does need to be replaced, we then need to identify alternatives. So can we actually get that fixed? Can we take it to a machinist? Do we really need to buy a new component, etc.? Weigh up the evidence. Normally with us and airworthiness, money comes into the big equation. What's going to be the cheapest way to fix the component so we can get the aircraft airworthy again? Then we choose one of those alternatives, take action, and then review our decision. So we've decided we're going to get the part remachined. We get it remachined, but when we get it back, we notice that, it didn't really get rid of the crack or whatever. So then we've got to review the decision and then maybe choose one of the other alternatives. So, getting another a new part, etc. Just recently in some training that I've done, I've come across what they call the OODA loop. which is also called the Boyd Circle, which was coined by Colonel John Boyd of the United States Air Force. And he was a fighter pilot in the Korean War. And his studies would lead to the fact that the pilot with the quickest OODA loop got to survive the dogfight. So the quicker you can go through the observe, orientate, decide and act decision cycle, the quicker that the more likely you were to survive in a dogfight. And the idea was you know, you observe where the enemy is, you orientate the enemy to your speed and position, etc. You decide on what to do and then you act. Now, of course, your enemy is doing exactly the same thing. So the idea is the guy who gets to act first ends up winning the show, because if he acts to say turns left, then the opponent, who's maybe still at the decide moment, then has to re-go back, and their OODA loop is reset. So they go back to observe, orientate, decide. Oh, he's now going to the right, I'll go that way. But of course, we're half a cycle ahead of him, so we go back the other way, it puts them out. So those that can go through the OODA loop the quickest. But in the slower person's side, any distraction and that sort of stuff mucks up their OODA loop and their decision-making process. And that can actually happen with us in our decision-making. Things that can impair our decision-making. So complacency. So repetition of actions. It's always worked, so it will always work. So, oh yeah, I won't bother replacing that because, you know, it's done 3 or 4 years of good service. We'll get an extra year out of it. You know, I've always been, you know, a glider in our club at Narrogin. We try and make sure that, you know, at least every second or third Form 2 annual inspections done by a different person. So you've got a different set of eyes looking over it all. You know, the manual was written by engineers, not by people who have to actually work on the glider. What would they know? The engineers have got a theoretical view on how to fix something, but not a practical view. So there's that particular sort of thought process. There's yeah, there, or just get a bigger hammer. You know, oh, you know, we'll try and get this pin in, and oh, it's a bit tight this time. Oh well, we'll just get a bigger hammer because that worked last time. Also, we in trying to work out how we decide which of the best course of action is, you know, we look without actually seeing. The brain sees what it expects to see, but is that what is really there? So when doing an inspection, we've talked about the new hoteliers requirements and that sort of stuff in BSE. You know, we expect to see the pin, the safety pin, in a particular location, and a quick look, the brain will see what it will expect to see, but is that what we're actually looking at? Perspective, how does that affect what we see? So if the safety pin on a hotel, and I'll use that again as an example, if that's on the other side and we can't see it, we might see the safety pin, but is it really in the right slot? Just because of the fact it's on the other side of the coupling. And lighting, as we've already found out, is the center of our eye is more receptive to bright light than it is dark light. And the sides are more receptive in low light conditions, but less acuity. So, you know, we might be seeing something, but we might be looking at something, but purely missing something quite obvious, just purely because of those things. We might be under time pressure. So, of course, making a decision and not weighing up all the odds, all the options and that sort of thing. And, you know, cutting corners We need to get this aircraft in the air. You know, there's weather coming, there's a comp coming, you know, whatever. So we can get time pressure put on ourselves by external and also internal. You know, we can put time pressures on ourselves, and also distractions. So, you know, we can be halfway through the decision-making process, get distracted, and then forget where we're up to in the task at hand. So putting it all together, I don't own my own glider, but I do love flying the club's Asteer. And for those that have Asteers or gliders with hoteliers, you know, as part of the DI, we've got to double check those hoteliers. So here's the elevator hotelier. So I've purposefully taken the photo in a shaded area to help my eyes adjust to the dark interior of the rudder cavity, to have a look to make sure that that hotelier is actually connected. Now, because I'm looking through this directly with the center of my eye, it needs a lot of light to get detail. And from the photo, we can't even see the hotelier. So let's get ourselves a torch, and voila, there she is. So adding extra light in there helps us to see the coupling on the inside. Again, with the Asteer, we're looking at hoteliers. That's the cover in the fuse, looking at the air brakes and the aileron hoteliers in there. This is outside. Obviously, the white of the fuse is making our eye, the pupil contract to reduce the amount of light going in. But of course, all the hoteliers are in a dark cavity. So again, you can see them, but can you actually see the detail? So again, adding a torch in there, even though it's daylight, we can now actually see the hoteliers and the pins in there. I should have taken a photo of one of the hoteliers on the other, on the left-hand side, because that's where the perspective is because of the safety pins actually underneath. So not only a torch, but sometimes it might actually be a good idea to actually use a mirror just to make sure that things are connected correctly. We'll finish off with this Airworthiness Alert, which recently came out in relation to a wing rigging failure. So the overview, the sailplane had recently completed an annual inspection for the issue of the maintenance release. And before we go much further, there's probably people online that know about this incident firsthand. Please, we're not going to be looking at pointing blame and fingers and that sort of stuff. What we're looking at doing is saying, okay, this incident occurred. What can we all learn out of it so that we don't make the same mistakes again? So it's all about learning from other people's experiences. So it's just come out of an annual inspection, and it was performing a post-maintenance evaluation flight. The glider was on aero tow, flying just above the ground when a loud cracking noise was heard. The flight was terminated immediately, and a landing straight ahead was successfully carried out. After landing, the glider exhibited an exaggerated dihedral, especially on the right-hand wing. On inspection, the connection between the lower wing spar and the attachments had failed. And they put the glider back together again in the hangar, and they were able to recreate the connection. And yeah, the right-hand wing certainly doesn't look like where it's supposed to be. On the inspection, it was suggested the initial inspection, the upper tapered bolt had engaged correctly during rigging, but the lower tapered bolt that holds the wing the spar in place had not engaged correctly. And they did some measurements, etc. And yeah, the tapered pin was only halfway in to the receptacle. So that's a bit of that's a diagram there. So the tapered bolt that holds the wing in place, top and bottom, and the bottom was not seated all the way in. On further inspection, they also noted that there was significant wear evident around the bottom part of the bolt, of the tapered bolt in there. So what had happened is when they were putting it in, the last little bit was quite hard. So instead of just using the standard tool, they actually used a bigger tool. You know, let's get a bigger hammer, and to sort of get it to seat correctly, but unfortunately it didn't seat correctly. A couple of recommendations from the GFA. So prior to rigging, the slot guide plates for the collar should be inspected for undue wear. Prior to rigging, the tapered bolt assembly must be inspected and confirmed to be in good condition, fully functional and serviceable. So, you know, all the things that we should be doing anyway. So making sure that, you know, no matter what the aircraft is, that all the components, etc., are actually serviceable. So, you know, not allowing distractions and that sort of stuff coming into play, and you know, making good decisions and taking time to make good decisions. And then, of course, after rigging, the collar should be inspected to ensure that it is fully in the retaining slots. And I've highlighted the next bit here because, you know, as we saw with the Astia, you know, just the limitations of the eye, we can't pick up just in natural daylight. So, you know, using a torch and, if necessary, a mirror to overcome those limitations to ensure that our wings are properly bolted on, that our controls are properly connected, etc. on there. So why did this happen? Look, I don't have any of the answers. These are just questions that, you know, sort of looking at this particular incident, you know, were they rushed in putting the glider together, which negated a thorough inspection, etc. Did they just look, or, you know, because of time pressure, or, you know, they could have been, you know, there could have been weather coming and that sort of stuff, which they allowed to affect their judgment. Were there other pressures involved? Did they, you know, what failed in the OODA loop? Was there distractions while they were putting the glider together? You know, they, put the pin in, etc., then got distracted and forgot to do a double check or a proper double check. Complacency gets us all. We've all done the same thing over and over and over and over again, and we expect the next time that we do something will be exactly the same. Things change, and so, you know, we've really got to overcome this complacency by just being diligent in what we do. And it might be the 50th time that we've done a daily inspection on our glider, but let's do the daily inspection as if it's the first time. We're inspecting our glider to buy it. And so, you know, remember the time when, you know, if you do own your own glider, when you did that initial inspection, you went over it with a fine-tooth comb. Well, do that, you know, with your daily, is go over it in a fine-tooth comb. Because at the end of the day, if we, you know, the mistakes we make in aviation, a lot of the time they're not forgiving. They're not forgiving in there. You know, we had a couple of guys that, you know, made those mistakes, and we had those issues, but we could all fall into that same trap. You know, no matter what sort of gliders and that sort of an aircraft that we fly, we're all human, we're all fallible, we can all fall into the same trap. Now that we're aware of those things, we need to mitigate them in our own operations. Just looking through the chat to see if there's yep. So yeah, sometimes a boroscope is the only way of actually checking. I actually went and bought one last year when doing a Form 2 because yeah, you're right. A boroscope can get in where the eyeball can't. So yeah, cool. All right, how do I hand this back to you?
You're on mute, Anthony.
Right, thanks, Phil. I should be able to share my screen now, and it should revert back to me.
Yep.
So not a problem. And I've lost my chat screen. I saw someone's chat come up. There we go. Yes, IS-28 main pins do need some thought to understand. I do have a little bit more recent information than what I provided, Phil, when we put this together. So we'll cover that one again a little bit later, but I won't go into a huge amount of detail because we've already had a bit of a discussion on it. On to recent incidents. 6 months ago, I talked about the low-profile nuts, which are now readily available in Australia. Since then, many have been found to be over-torqued, and this was due to the previous Form 2, so something 12 months ago. So it's not something to do with the nuts available in Australia, but people are torquing these up as if they're full-sized M6 nuts, and are using probably twice as much torque as what is actually bolts actually capable of handling, or the nuts actually capable of handling. This thing to remember, these are for shear purposes only, they're not for tension purposes. They have a recommended maximum of 4 Newton meters for an M6, which is 4 kilos at the end of a 10 centimeter spanner, and you can very easily pull 4 kilos with just 1 or 2 fingers at the end of a 10 centimeter spanner. You've only got 3 or 4 threads gripping onto the thread of the bolt, which is why you end up with that less torque capability. And the strength of the joint is coming from the strength of the bolt in shear, not from the clamping force and pulling everything together and using friction between the two surfaces to clamp things together. Also, last time I had a large discussion on undercarriages. These still are a hot favourite for causing problems. DG 300 on the 4th of July, undercarriage collapse on rollout after landing. That's still under investigation, or I'm waiting for further results on that. There was a DG 1000 on the 6th of July. The wheel brake was ineffective on landing. They had a leak coming from the seals and the brake caliper dripping down onto the tyre. And somewhat humorously, a Pawnee tow plane on the 30th of August, the tail wheel fell off during an aero tow. It was an AEF, so the AEF witnessed the tail wheel falling off the tug. Not one to inspire confidence. The pivot bolt that secures the casting assembly had failed, so the tail wheel and the forks fell off. Also, in the last 6 months, there has been a revision of the inspection schedules for the K6, K7 and ASK13 tailplane. This is for the end rib on the elevator. It's a known problem for glue degradation from moisture getting into the joint. This is as a result of an accident that happened in Hungary, where the elevator parted company with the aircraft during a winch launch. It landed safely. It was noted during the daily inspection that the left-hand elevator had a different amount of deflection to the right-hand elevator. So there were signs during the DI that something was wrong between the two halves of the elevator, but it wasn't further investigated. During the flight, the debonding of the rib allowed the elevator to move outboard, and so it came off the outboard pin. The only thing holding it on was then the trim tab actuator, which tore off. So the elevator landed on the runway. The aircraft managed a circuit and landing again. Important to note that this has been made applicable to the Schneider-built KA6 aircraft as well. The K6Es are exempt. They have the all-flying tail rather than the conventional tailplane. Schleicher now recommend to not do spins in these aircraft. It has not been mandated by the ARSA at the moment. I am in contact with the ARSA at the moment to see if we can get a alternate means of compliance on this, and look at using a modern approved adhesive that doesn't suffer from water damage to replace this area and get away from the problem altogether. We've had a lot of recent incidents that relate back to the annual inspections. These all happened within very close to the annual inspections. So DG1000, and I'll point out there's quite a few DG1000s mentioned tonight. It's not the fault of the aeroplane, it's just one of the operators of the aircraft are really efficient at submitting defect reports and SOR reports when something goes astray. DG1000, 28th of August, during the first DI after the Form 2, both ASIs were found to have no pitot response. During the annual inspection, person A tested and refitted both ASIs and checked that they were connected. Afterwards, person B worked on the nose release and disconnected the pitot plumbing, and it wasn't reconnected afterwards. There was apparently time pressure to get the aircraft out of the workshop as a factor in that. ASW20B on the 18th of September, someone's scribbled on my slide there. During evaluation flight after the annual inspection, the pilot selected flap position 4, which I think is the thermaling position. I think Drew Martini will soon correct me if I'm wrong. And found that the aileron movement was restricted. The aircraft landed safely. The bolt in the aileron flap mixer had been installed in the wrong direction, and there was a clash between the tail of the bolt and another component. During the annual inspection, okay, thank you. The comment there is the bolt was installed as the same as other aircraft, but the clearance was different in this aircraft. During the annual inspection, person A removed the control rod bolts, but didn't take any photos or notes of the installation. They encountered some problems elsewhere during the annual inspection, and the aircraft was then given over to person B to fix those other problems, but the bolts were still removed. Person B reinstalled the control rod bolts, and they were installed within a system, as you would expect. But it became readily apparent that the complete full and free movement checks of the flap and the ailerons were not carried out for all the possible permutations, combinations of flap position and ailerons, either at the end of the Form 2 or during the first DI. ASK 21, 26th of September, the Form 2 was completed the previous day. During the DI of the aircraft, it was noted that there is very little free play between the release knobs and the structure of the cockpit. A functional test of the system was carried out and found the releases to be serviceable. One flight was conducted with a normal winch launch. However, during the hooking on of the winch at the second launch, the rings pulled out when the ground crew applied tension to the rope to check that it was hooked on properly. The free play in the release system was adjusted to allow a little bit more gap between the knobs and the structure, and the aircraft operated fine after that. Now, in VSE, I think it's recommended to have about 5 or 6 millimeters of clearance there between the end of the knob and the structure or the instrument panel that emerges out of. Another DG1000, 26th of September. During the DI, it was noticed that the lock nut on the port inboard air brake pivot arm wasn't within safety. It had 0 thread protruding. Further investigation showed that the bolt had not been pulled up tight. The nut wasn't loose. It couldn't be either loosened or tightened by hand. But it had at least 29 DIs since the Form 2. And you can see that previously there'd been some witness paint painted on the system. That wasn't present this time round, and there's 1.5 mil gap protruding, slop in the bolt. Now that could potentially catch, depending on the tolerances and clearances on the airplane, on something and prevent operation of the air brakes appropriately. That had been present for some time and hadn't been picked up on during the DIs. This one's a bit of a story. JS1B, 3rd of November 21, so very fresh. The second flight after the annual inspection, the evaluation flight was the day before, and the aircraft was operated without ballast during that evaluation flight. During the second flight, it was a cross-country flight. The pilot was on final glide and encountered extensive sink. The pilot decided to dump water. Whilst on circuit for an outlanding, the pilot attempted to start the sustainer jet, but after the engine's initial spool up, it shut down with an error message. This engine had previous problems, but had been successfully ground run during the morning of that day. On final, the rate of descent was much higher than normal, and the aircraft was undershooting the fence. I will point out that the outlanding planning and circuit planning on this was very much on the low side. The pilot opted to veer left to land alongside the fence, so it's turned to the left wing down. The left wing has contacted the ground at some point during the proceeding of the landing. The pilot's unclear as to whether he was still in the air at the time or whether he just touched down or not. The aircraft rotated 180 degrees and landed in reverse. Whilst preparing for the retrieve, the pilot found that the left wing was still full of water. There's 90-100 kilos of water still in the left wing. The dump valve lever was in the open position in the cockpit, but the drain on the underside of the wing was covered over by transparent adhesive patch, so some clear contact, which was presumably applied at the Form 2 inspection. The pilot hadn't noticed this on either of the daily inspections. So it had left the workshop like this. So the case in point here is, if you're going to be covering up something on the aeroplane like vents, dump valves, static ports, pitot ports, things like that, use coloured contrasting tape or film. Also dog ear a corner over back on itself so that it protrudes away from the surface. It makes it a lot easier to see. So 10 out of 10, I suspect it when the aircraft was in Form 2, it was upside down, and the maintainer has put the film over the water ballast dump to stop ingress of FOD or crud from the workshop getting in there. Hasn't removed it on the way out of the hangar, and because it was transparent, it was very hard to see. I do wonder, with the extra 100 kilos I saw on board, just what the margins on the person's stall speed was during that circuit as well. So, take-home message, the first flight or flights after the annual inspection have a much higher risk than what would be considered normal. We have seen control issues, instrument issues, system functionality issues, and of course the ever-present FOD, tools left in aircraft. Odd nuts and bolts and washers and bits of lock wire floating around the system. The first daily inspection and of course the independent inspection needs to be extra vigilant and very thorough when you're looking at these airplanes coming out of annual inspection. With the ASW20, at some point, all the possible permutations of flap and control deflection, and add-on deflections in particular, should be checked. And that should really apply to any aircraft with a flap aileron mixing circuit. Really need to double check that there's not just full and free control of movement in neutral. A Grob 109 on the 31st of July, the aircraft had been pushed partially into a hangar to get out of the wind for an engine oil change. After the oil change, the engine was turned over by hand with the ignition off to help circulate the oil through the filter. And then the engine was started for a brief period of time before checking the oil levels. The person in command, or pilot in command, started the engine while standing outside the aircraft, and the fuselage was still inside the hangar. Now that breaches a couple of the civil aviation rules. First one is you have to have someone in the cockpit when you're running the engine at all times, and that person has to know what they're doing. The other one is you have to be well clear of buildings when you're doing engine runs. Does anyone remember the runaway aircraft at Parafield in South Australia, August 2001? I had the dubious pleasure of witnessing the damaged aircraft a couple of days after that happened, when they got moved into the hangars. There'd been an attempted hand start of a single-engined aircraft with no one in the cockpit. The aircraft had jumped the chocks and then ploughed through 4 aeroplanes before arriving at the poor old Seminole there and filleting the aft half of the Seminole. Imagine something like that happening in a hangar with people nearby with nowhere to run. An interesting one, DG 400. During the flight, the canopy was partially jettisoned. The canopy jettison knob sits on the right-hand sill of the cockpit frame. The cockpit air vent knob is just under that on the starboard side of the cockpit. The pilot had a flight computer mounted on the suction cap on the canopy, which obscured the view of both. The pilot went to open the air vent and pulled the canopy jettison knob. The reason why I bring this up is most people go and install these optional extras during the Form 2 season. In this case, even though there was the positive identification of controls in the form of colour coding, there was the knobs for the jettison is a different shape and feel to the air vent knob. It just couldn't easily be seen. It couldn't be visually identified. It's a self-launch aeroplane. The instrument panel's really crowded. So when you're looking at installing extra instruments, these extra accessories, it's really important to consider the cockpit ergonomics and the safe operation of the airplane. Not just, it's just really handy to have that widget right there. You'll notice in the photo, this is a recreation of the event, that there's been multiple locations for where the suction cap's been applied. You can see the coffee rings on the side of the cockpit. There's one that's well forward and a bit above its current location there, and by a little bit of rough guesstimate, that location was probably okay. You're probably able to see underneath the display there and see the jettison knob and the air vent quite successfully, but on this time the person's installed it further aft, lower down, and it's blocked with view. A Janus B, 19th of September, during a cross-country flight, I believe it was. Both pilots' harnesses came undone at different times during the flight, and this happened 3 times whilst thermaling. It's the FB9 harness, FB19 harness, like in the photo there. The front pilot is a fairly mature build, and they were thermaling with a lot of backstick. Now, I'm told that the Janus B cockpit ergonomics means the seat and stick position are quite close to each other. In both cases, the control stick was aft enough so that the pilot with their hand was in contact with the spring clip, and when the on the harness, and when the stick was moved to the right, it unclipped the tongue of the spring clip from the harness. The spring clip tension was fine, it wasn't deformed. The harness is otherwise quite serviceable. It happened twice in a similar fashion in the back seat. I had quite a few conversations with the club involved. They're looking at actually ballasting the aircraft a bit more, so it's a bit more tail heavy. I understand that the front pilot's also doing a little bit about the mature build aspect of it. DG1000, 26th of September. On the landing roll, the crew smelled an electrical fumes odour. The crew vacated the glider and found later on that the ditto log and flam wiring was not the right colour. This was in the near the back shell of the connector that plugs in. In the end, they inspected other aircraft, couldn't find a problem there. They removed the ditto wiring and kept on operating the aeroplane with the ditto and the flam. Sorry, the ditto inoperable, but the flam was operable. I haven't got any photos of what the problem was there. I suspect it was a dry joint or something like that in where the wiring joins onto the pin. Another DG1000S, 6th November. The instructor noticed the trainee was exceeding speeds on launch, or very close to exceeding speeds on launch by approximately 10 knots. This was unusual because the pilot had previously demonstrated very good speed control. After launch, it was found that there was a 10-knot discrepancy between the front and the rear ASIs. The rear reading higher than the front. They couldn't find a fault with the aircraft or the aircraft pedostatic system. They've removed the ASI and found and confirmed that it's still reading 10 knots high on the manometer. They sent it to an instrument repair shop, which found that the diaphragm was contacting the support post in the instrument, so it's from manufacturer. There must have been very, very close tolerances during the manufacture, and over time it's deformed itself a bit further and come into contact. This goes on to the IS-28. I'll talk about the sequence of events as I know about it. On the 9th of July, I received some correspondence about an IS-30. The IS-30 is a unflapped IS-28 with unusual wear pattern on the main pin cones. After further investigation, it found that the guide plates that these cones slide up and down, so these are the guide plates here, these had been reversed at some point in the past, so they were upside down on the aeroplane, and that meant that the central collar, and I've got photos of this later, was not quite so central anymore, and that one cone was fully engaging and the other cone wasn't, which is what was leading to this wear pattern. I will point out that there's been accidents in the past leading to fatalities where aircraft using these tapered cone kind of arrangements for their main pin connections haven't been rigged properly, connected properly. And that's either caused fatigue failures because of high stress loads going through one of the fittings instead of both fittings on the plates here, or just been complete failure of the joint. On the 21st of October, I received a phone call about an IS-28B2, whether it was okay to operate the aircraft without the Form 2 being signed off in the logbook. The person doing the annual inspection had been called away very suddenly by a family emergency and hadn't finished the paperwork. And this person had given a verbal saying it was okay to issue the maintenance release. Under these circumstances, it's really a high risk that this person has raced off because there's been a major problem in their family. What have they forgotten? This is this human factors bit again. What have they left out or not remembered to go and do? The other point is they were given a verbal to other people to sign out for their work. And that's got a fair old legal risk associated to it. The person signing out for this thing is accepting the responsibility for what's happened during the Form 2. They're certifying that this was all done correctly. So if you're not confident that the work was done correctly, you really shouldn't have the pen in your hand. Briefly mentioned, as per Phil, this was the evaluation flight after the annual inspection. It was rigged in the hangar. They had trouble rigging the aircraft. As soon as the aircraft got off the ground, the rear seat pilot heard a crunching noise and aborted the launch. And the right-hand photo there is the scene immediately afterwards. During the rigging, they'd used an extension bar on the T-handle, which winds those cones out, and this is expressly forbidden in the flight manual. I suspect this was a bad habit that they'd been doing over some time, just to help force the pins home. In this case, the lower wing fittings were simply not aligned, so there was no way that that lower cone was going to go through the lower fitting. As more force was applied to the rigging tool, the lower pin was not moving, and this forced the central collar. The central collar is this collar here, which is on the threaded rod that drives the upper and lower cone up and down, and it's supposed to be sitting inside a groove inside that guide plate there. The additional force pushed this collar out of that guide plate. This then allowed the upper pin to be fully engaged in the upper fitting, but the lower pin was not engaged at all. And so the wing started to fold up as soon as the aircraft started flying. Both the DI and the independent inspection missed this. I will point out that there was a very experienced person who everyone trusted, who was in charge of doing the rigging. I suspect there's a lot of complacency involved in the crew, that this person who knows what they're doing has done it, and they were doing a fairly peripheral check of what was connected and what wasn't. This is as close to de-rigging an aircraft in flight as I ever want to see. So from discussions tonight, what can you change with the way you think and the way you approach airworthiness activities that you're involved with that will make a positive difference? That's the take-home thoughts of tonight. I'll open up to any questions in a second. As always, I'm open to feedback on how well this went tonight. Whether you've got any topics you want discussed in the future, please drop me an email. I will apologise to those people in Western Australia where I got the time zone horribly stuffed around and some of the people joined late. This is recorded and it will be on YouTube later on, and I'll let people know when it appears there. So I'll open up to any questions. Remember, if you want to ask verbally, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Lyle McLean, Bathurst Soaring Club.
G'day, Lyle. How are you going?
Good, good. I just want to make a comment about the tail wheel departing from the Pawnee. We've had this happen on about 3 occasions over the years at Bathurst Soaring Club, and we finally changed the assembly from a single bolt to a 2-bolt system. We haven't had a trouble since. The single bolt one basically puts a bending load under the bolt, and it slowly fatigues the bolt underneath the head of the nut, and it just cracks off. So if you can, those have got the single bolt system should replace it with the double bolt system, and it should be okay after that.
Was there a mod or an STC for the double bolt system available? Oh,
it's a standard Pawnee. It's a standard Pawnee. It's a later model Pawnee assembly. They're interchangeable.
Right. Fine. Just a comment. It's a Scott system.
Yes. Just if I can make a comment on it, was actually the tug pilot that was involved in that. It's not actually.
You don't need to identify yourself.
It was quite a fortunate incident, really, because actually the tail of the tug had just lifted off the ground when the thing departed. So thankfully it didn't happen at height. And luckily, of course, the glider was airborne at that stage, so they didn't run over it. But yeah, there's certainly the passenger saw it and noted it was some interest. And in fact, commented later, "Is that normal?" But it actually wasn't the bolt that retains the tail wheel to the leaf spring. It's actually the pivot bolt that goes through the centre of the wheel that allows the.
Oh, okay, right, gotcha.
So,
yep.
We've had the same issue with the attachment bolt. In fact, every 200 hours now, we replace that bolt as a matter of course. So, but I've never seen one go where the actual pivot bolt is actually sheared, and it was actually fatigue failure.
Roger Drewis, if I can just make a few comments. Basically, the Pawnee rear end and the tail end, there's 3 places where they break. One's on the central pivot bolt between the upper part of the casting and the lower part of the casting. It fatigues in the radius because the bolt is a stepped item. There's no mandatory replacement on these things. I'm damned if I know why we haven't got into a repetitive action. Then you've got the mounting bolts. So yes, the 2-bolt mounting the leaf spring is very much better than the single bolt Scott tail wheel pattern is really for super cups and things. But the other one which people can forget about is the front bolt mounting the tail leaf springs into the airframe. That used to be a CASA AD for repetitive replacement. I think that AD was a bloody good idea, and somehow we lost sight of it. That's the other bolt in the rear end, which would be bloody good idea to do repetitive replacement on. Bolts are cheap. Tail wheels falling off stop you flying, stop you launching. Might even fall somewhere on the ground where you don't want something to impact the ground. That's it.
It's interesting, Roger, that that AD that CASA had, that was actually written by Dave Villiers. And I actually contacted Dave about this a couple of years ago, and he can't even remember why they issued it. But it's certainly not around anymore.
Yeah, I will point out that Pawnees are not a GFA problem. It's a CASA problem for airworthiness, but I'm quite happy to take airworthiness ideas to CASA. I've mentioned it tonight because many of the people involved in Pawnee airworthiness, not tow plane airworthiness, are also involved in glider airworthiness. So learning point. There's a comment there about delays in submitting Form 2 reports. Has the change to Go membership contributed? I don't think so. Form 2 reports are not submitted back through Go membership. I did have a standalone web page there to do it online. I think you had to get to it via Go membership, unfortunately, but still by far most of the Form 2s are emailed into Fiona and Tanya to enter directly. I'm on the record as not liking Go membership either. There's a comment there about...
Can you hear me at all?
Yes, Trevor, I can hear.
I think I've asked about this in the past, I think, but, a collection of something like a wiki for each aircraft of the sorts of things, problems and things that have gone wrong in the past. So, if you're doing a Form 2 on a particular aircraft, you can go to that to see the sorts of problems others have had in the past, and such as the IS-30 there before. That's not in an AD as such at the moment, at least anyway, but it's things to look for, whether a plate's been reversed or whatever. Is that some sort of a database that may be on the GFA system?
What I'm looking at doing, one is we've reinvigorated the AM process. So a lot of this stuff is going to start feeding into the AM system. And there's been a number of airworthiness alerts which have now passed a couple of years of age, which we've now rolled into AMs on those aircraft. it'll be a job in hand for Dennis to start rolling in some of the defects and other incident reports we've seen into the ANs, and so they will be recorded there. I am looking at the feasibility of having an online defect report page on the web page where you can look up your model of aircraft and then get a list of defect reports that have been submitted on that type. That's in a feasibility and legal review at the moment to see just what our legal responsibilities are there. Still working on that one at the moment. At the moment, we're focused very heavily on the AN system and getting that up and running.
Yeah,
I think a lot of people tend to ignore the old ANs these days.
Everyone's going to be quiet, then I won't be quiet. It's Roger again. Look, out of Phil Dodd's presentation towards the end there, really, when you have problems in this area, it points to the question of what are you doing about within your own club system about trying to improve things, or if we're having incidents with gliders, what are we doing to improve them? And we had a terrible event with a LS3 a long time ago where the starboard main spar pin wasn't fully engaged, and the handle was in front of the locking mechanism, not after the locking mechanism. Factory said it couldn't happen. Well, it did happen, but you could engineer it out, and that's what we did. And thanks to Mike Burns for his approval of that small mod, which made it impossible to get wrong. So sometimes you need to think about engineering things out, or procedurally removing the problems, not being passive about things.
As an engineer, I fully agree with trying to improve things. We do have a problem with getting these alterations and modifications approved now with the passing of Mike. It's difficult now to find volunteers who want to put that level of effort in. Next GFA financial year, we'll look at seeing if we can engage an outside agency to provide that service to GFA, and just research just what it will cost to get that same kind of capability back again. Normally engaging 21J engineers is a pretty expensive business. Andrew Simpson is working on extending what minor changes that we can legally do in MOSP 3, and expanding that a bit, and work with CASA on that one.
How do people become aware of what mods are available? I think there's a mod for the air brakes on a Cirrus, for example. Where are those sorts of things listed?
Unfortunately, with the way that the mod system works, each mod is applicable to the one aircraft, either the one that the aircraft that effectively paid for the mod. To do a fleet-wide change is called a supplemental type certificate, and there's a lot more onerous and therefore expensive to achieve. As we work through and make sure that we've got all the I's dotted and T's crossed on Mike's comprehensive suite of work, I'm looking at, again, the AN system, and then putting a list of what mods have been done previously to aircraft in the AN system. That way you'll be able to see what's been done and hopefully present the work that Mike has done to another 21J person or organisation, and get a cheaper approval process because of the work that was done before. But to make it fleet-wide would be a supplemental type certificate, and I can't see that getting done cheaply.
No, but okay, I did a mod on an instrument panel on the Jantar, and turned out well. But if someone else wanted to copy that now, they're not even aware that someone has done a mod on an instrument panel.
Yep, and for someone else to use that mod, they would need to get separate approval. is the point I was making, unless that mod was part of a supplemental type certificate. What I'm looking at doing is
they don't get to go that. They don't.
That came through very
Sorry,
briefly.
they don't get to even, if they don't know such a thing is available, then they don't know to
So
apply.
what I am looking at doing is listing all of the approved mods that the GFA holds records for on the ANs that apply to that aircraft type. So if you looked at the AN for your Jantar type, you would, when we get that amount of work done, you would then see a list of what mods have been approved on other aircraft of that same type that we have records for.
Yeah. Thank you.
Do we have maintenance manuals online? That's up to the manufacturer. The GFA technical library will hold a copy of the original flight manual and the original maintenance manual as issued, which is part of the type acceptance work, but it's not held up to date. To get the most up-to-date maintenance manuals, you'll need to go to the manufacturer, and they normally will provide it on request. They don't seem to have it available immediately online for public consumption. Do I have a source for the reduced height lock nuts? Yes, it's in the previous webinar, webinar number 3. That's on the Guiding Australia YouTube channel. I will email you separately. Just make a note. There's a Bozard distributor who's in Melbourne, actually. Any more for any more? Lindsay's got his hands up.
Just reference to the IS-28 rigging situation. I think the important thing which should definitely be taken into account in this is, and I'm quite experienced at rigging Brazov aircraft, is that it's very, very clear to never use an extension to that to the rigging bar, to the Allen key fitment that tightens those nuts. The bolt turns the bolt, and if you use an extension, that's when that stress comes into the guide in the middle, and I think this is something that it appears in other aircraft, is that if the manufacturer says something has to be to a certain tension or done a certain way, that has to be the way. They've got that there for a very good reason. So I'm not going to go into the rigging of the 28 because that's it's a lot more complicated, but this applies very much that should not be. It's very, very clearly stated in the maintenance manual, in the flight manual, in everything on those aircraft, that an extension bar should never be used. And if you've got just by hand pressure, there's no way you can work. You just can't generate enough hand pressure. So that's my thoughts with that.
Yep. Thanks, Lindsay. You can take your hand down now.
Yeah, I have.
Anybody else? Maybe add the nut link to the list of suppliers. Yes, we are working on that information on the GFA site. When we changed over sites, that information was taken down because it was very out of date. I know Dennis was working on checking all the links and updating that. I think it's been swamped with other work at the moment. Well, if there's no one else, thank you very much for everyone attending. At one stage there, we had 98 people in attendance. If you have further questions, you can contact me directly on the CAD email address. And well, in parting, I wish everyone to have a great Christmas and lots of happy soaring, and we'll catch you all in the new year. Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony.